Good morning, everybody.
Good morning to you.
Morning.
So let's thank God for the gift of learning Torah together, and then we'll get right into it. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. So the 50 pages that we read for today are certainly eventful and has a lot material in it. And I wanted to first just start by inviting your thoughts and comments about what was most salient to you in these pages that we read. Anything strike anybody? Please, Linda.
I think not that anything was particularly new, but the way that she put it, that the combination of dehumanization and not having a lower caste to blame things on has, led to this despair among many of the, I would say, people from, what was it, say, 50s to 70s, whatever, who've really come down in terms of life expectancy, in terms of accomplishments, and I think she's called it deaths of despair. I think.
Right. Well, wasn't her right? Angus and Dean, who are these Princeton scholars, came up with that, and she referenced it in her chapter.
Yeah,
but right,
that was an interesting way to put it. And then there's this other book I'm reading for another book club called Tightrope, which goes into the details of what's happened in the United States and the lack of jobs for a lot of those people in that age group, and how very, detailed discussion of how that happened.
Yes.
So I think it's that combination that has resulted in what we're seeing now. And I just thought it was put succinctly.
Yeah. One of the things that flows from what you said about what you wrote is that the caste system victimizes both the upper caste and the lower caste. I mean, the lower caste in ways that we are more obvious and that we think about more readily, but the lower castes, the higher castes, in terms of a perceived slight that they should be higher, they should be more. And when that doesn't work, that creates a lot of anger and outrage, and also self-destruction. And she brought that up, in many ways in those pages. By the way, you referenced Tightrope. There was also, I think I mentioned this last time, but having read the chapter 11, made me think about it again. Strangers in Their Own Land, about rural Louisiana, and their main complaint is that other people, like Black people, like the Black President Obama, are cutting in line. They're cutting in line, which is another way of saying they're not respecting their place in the caste system. And that was the main complaint from rural Louisiana that this woman brought in Strangers in Their Own Land. Other things that struck you about these pages, and was there anything that you read it and you disagreed and you thought what she's saying is not right or it's not fair? Okay. Paul?
Comparing the Nazis and the Black situation, there is a major difference which we haven't mentioned yet. The principal aim in the long run for the Nazis was to destroy the Jewish civilization, eliminate the people and eliminate the culture. The system involving Blacks, particularly during slavery, was one of subjugation, but maintained them because they were of economic benefit. they were the economic engine for creating gross domestic product at that time.
Mm.
So that's one difference. Another thing she talked about is this despair. And I think part of that despair is economic, in that minimum wage has just not kept pace with inflation. So that people who are in the lower end economically, culturally, and educationally are falling, they're not even staying even, they're falling behind. Whereas the people who know how to make a lot of money have done extremely well.
Right. So let's take a look. I wanna pivot now. Building on that point. If you'll turn to page 180, and because I think that if you read this, it tells us both so much about our Torah reading this coming week, and it tells us so much about our country in this moment. But this one page tells us both about our Torah reading and about our country. In caste terms, these are the least well-off, most precariously situated members of the dominant caste in America. For generations, they could take for granted their inherited rank in the hierarchy and the benefits that accrued from it. Then we may underestimate, though, the aftershocks of a shift in demographics, the erosion of labor unions, the perceived loss of status, the fears about their place in the world, resentment that the kind of security their fathers could rely upon might now be waning, rising immigration from across the Pacific and the Rio Grande, and the ascendance of a Black man as a president made for an inversion of the world as many had known it. And some of them might have been more susceptible to the calls to take our country back after 2008 and to make America great again in 2016. In America, political scientists have given this malaise of insecurities a name: dominant group status threat. This phenomenon is not the usual form of prejudice or stereotyping that involves looking down on outgroups who are perceived to be inferior. Instead, it is born of a sense that the outgroup is doing too well and thus is a viable threat to one's own dominant group status. And then goes on to talk about how this despair leads to anger, the sense of eroding place leads to anger, despair, etc. In other words, ironically, the people in the upper caste are very precarious and are doing, in America, as she quotes Angus and Dean, they're doing worse than communities of color. I wanted to just put that under the microscope because I think it connects very directly to our Torah reading. So if you look on page 387, this was from last week's Torah reading. This is after the 10th plague. Verse 30, Pharaoh arose in the night with all his courtiers and all the Egyptians. There was a loud cry in Egypt, for there was no house where there was not someone dead. He summoned Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night. Up, depart from among my people, you and the Israelites with you. Go, worship the Lord as you said. Take your flocks, your herds, and be gone. And may you bring a blessing upon me also. In other words, Pharaoh has a moment of humility. And then, verse 33, the Egyptians urged the people on. So the Egyptians wanted them to go, impatient to have them leave the country. For they said, we shall all be dead. And that's why they left before the dough was leavened. You can thank verse 34 for the gift of matzah. Okay, so last week they leave. And then what happens, and not only do they leave, but Pharaoh says, you know what? Basically, I'm humbled. Will you bless me? Will your God bless me? I'm humbled. And the Egyptians also are very humbled and afraid, and they just want the Jews out of there. Go now. Now, what happens between that and this week's portion? Take a look at page 401 and 402, pages 2 and 3 of your reading. That's this week's reading. So when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, and of course they told them to go now, Pharaoh and his courtiers had a change of heart about the people and said, Mazot asinu kishilachnu et Israel me'avdenu. What is this that we have done? Releasing Israel from our service. He ordered his chariot and took his men with him. So now Pharaoh himself is so agitated. He doesn't stay in the palace and send the troops out. He orders his own chariot and takes his men with him, right? He took 600 of his picked chariots and the rest of the chariots of Egypt with officers in all of them. So he's mounting the strongest army. This is for ex-slaves. The Lord stiffened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he gave chase to the Israelites. And as the Israelites were departing defiantly, Biyad Ramah. Now, note also this language that the Israelites, Biyad Ramah with a Biyad Ramah is literally with a lifted hand, but with proud, like being erect, with an erect bearing, with a proud carriage, proud presence, right? And remember the part of Caste where she talks about docility, docile, D-O-C-I-L-E, and how docility is required in the caste system. And, she tells the story of the black kid who's talking to the white principal in the deep South. And the white principal says, you're obviously not from here. Why did you say that? Because you're looking at me in the eyes. And, black kids were raised to not look at the teacher in their face because that's too much intimacy. You have to look down. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. No, sir. No, ma'am. And no equality, no intimacy. No, we're both actually humans. So a part of the structure is the lower caste has to act in a lower way. And here the Israelites are leaving Biyad Ramah, kind of with an erect presence, with an erect carriage, with a proud presence. And then the Egyptians gave chase to them, and all the chariot horses of Pharaoh, his horsemen, his warriors, overtook them and camped by the sea. So here's what I want to ask you. I want to ask you how Isabel Wilkerson's book on caste and the emotions of the caste system, especially for those on top, but for those who are precariously on top, how does that interpret our Torah portion? I feel very much like these two texts, the ancient text and the modern text of Wilkerson, really reinforce each other. Anyone see the connection here? Why does Pharaoh, why does Pharaoh have a change of heart? And why is he able to summon all these Egyptians to go chasing after the Jews when they had just said that Jews not only have to go, but have to go now? You don't even have 18 minutes for your bread to rise. So why the sudden and decisive change of heart? Linda, thank you, Linda.
They realize they won't have anyone underneath them anymore.
Yeah.
And that's something they don't want to tolerate.
Right. And I think Paul was mentioning economics and the slavery of the economics of slavery. And Wilkerson mentions that a lot. And we know that there's certainly an economic aspect to it. And the slaves built Pithom and Ramses. So there's an economic, but there's also an emotional. Like we get to, and by the way, principle 7 of pillar 7 of the 7 pillars of caste is cruelty, right? Whipping. And that, Wilkerson describes how in the antebellum South, the masters would whip slaves really for no offense, just to assert dominance and to promote docility and subservience. And in Exodus 1, in the first chapter, the whip is there, and the Egyptians work them and whip them and whip them and whip them. That's part of the ancient Jewish story as well as the Black story. And so there's an emotional component, which is these are our slaves. We get to own them and dominate them, and we miss the economics, but we really miss the relationship of dominance. And I think that is what causes Pharaoh. If you look at what I just read from Exodus 14, it's very emotional, right? I mean, it's not like they had a whole war plan and a war room and thought about this. It was they had kind of a change of heart and a very intense and very purple and very emotional reaction. And Pharaoh goes and all the soldiers go and all the chariots go. They're just like crazed with emotion. And I think she gets at that emotion, the emotion of the caste system. What is it that, why is it that the people who should be below us are no longer below us? And I want to talk about that, but then I want to pivot to our country. Because for a long time, I've been wondering about the bogus fraud claims that every institution of our democracy has said are bogus. Every court has said it's bogus, including courts with Trump-appointed judges. The Supreme Court with 3 Trump-appointed justices did not disrupt that. The secretaries of state in Georgia and other Republican officials said there was no fraud. The head of cybersecurity said it's the most secure election ever. William Barr said there's no evidence of fraud. And yet millions of people feel there is millions of people feel there is fraud, even though all the institutions of democracy have officially spoken and said no fraud. Then I couldn't really understand what is going on with that. I mean, I just did not understand. I mean, the Supreme Court's the Supreme Court, and 3 of the judges are appointed by former President Trump. What is this? And now I finally, from this reading of Wilkerson and Beshalach, there's a deep emotionality. It's not rational. It's not rational. It's a deep emotionality, and somehow I think that deep emotionality is like, my world is changing, my place is slipping, and I don't like it. I'm going to call that fraud. And I think that is what's going on in our beloved and tormented country right now. Any other thoughts or comments from anybody? Dottie. Dottie, could you please unmute?
Okay. All right.
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Now, this book has done a number on me. I can't believe I know it. I know these things. I'm old enough to live through much of it, but I think it's a herd mentality. They can't, it's the same as the Egyptians, because they realized they didn't want to give up what they had. The Southerners, I don't think a lot of them ever got over the fact that slavery was against the law, because through the 40s into the 50s, the horrible things that were perpetrated on the Black people, to this day, I believe they think that there is still slavery. They can't give it up, because she talks about that fellow who, when he came to wherever it was, and he went to work for the first time, there were Black people there, educated him. He couldn't, when he shook the Black person's hand, it did a number on him. They can't accept, not the law of the land, they can't accept law as life as it is today, or last year or 20 years. I think that's what it is. They're still fighting civil war. The fact that there are no more slaves and the Black people are elevated to be just like everybody else. They can't accept it.
Right, and I think there's a deep emotional part of that, and yeah, and it's in the Torah reading when Pharaoh goes after the ex-slaves, and it's in Caste, and the question that arises is, and this is a real question. It's not a rhetorical question. How does this story end? Because in the Torah reading, the way this story ends is that the precarious caste members who were above, the Egyptians, who are used to whipping Jews whenever they want to whip Jews, and now the Jews are gone, and now they resent it, and they want to change it, and they want to get the Jews back, and they want to do Jim Crow on the Jews, and they want to continue to own the Jews. The Egyptians die. That's how the story finally ends. The Egyptians die, right? And obviously that's not the way it ends in the real world, and that's not the way it ends in a cultural democracy that's diverse. So what we are left with is an ongoing tension that just is constantly recurring from generation to generation. I was listening to there's a show on if you have Alexa or one of those speaker devices, the New Yorker Radio Hour, and there was so it's like it's a radio program that highlights the best thought pieces of the New Yorker, and there was a piece about the relationship / obsession that Herbert Hoover had with Martin Luther King. And Herbert Hoover hated, bold, underline, exclamation mark, Martin Luther King. And, it was well known that King was not just an adulterer, but he was a compulsive adulterer. And Herbert Hoover wanted to use this and destroy him, and it was personal. And the question that this piece asked about Herbert Hoover was, why is this guy who's so powerful, the head of the FBI for 50 years, why is he literally obsessed with MLK? And according to the scholars that they had on this segment, it was because Herbert Hoover grew up in a white-dominated America where everybody knew their place, and the whites' place was on top. And, I'm sorry, J. Edgar Hoover. My apologies, J. Edgar Hoover. And the blacks were below. And when J. Edgar Hoover saw this Martin Luther King trying to change it up, what's at stake was the America that I love. And the America that I love is a caste system where whites are here and blacks are here, and MLK is trying to change that up. And so J. Edgar Hoover was bananas, like Ahab and Moby Dick, had to try to get MLK, and what was at stake was saving the country. So I guess what I'm saying here is that it's a deeply emotional thing. It's not rational, which is why it would never work if you were to talk to somebody who thinks there's fraud in the election, and you were to give them the written court opinions of 50 duly appointed judges, including many Republicans appointed by former President Trump. They would. It's not at that level. It's not a rational thing. It's not an evidence-based thing. It's an emotional thing. It's a Kishka thing. My country, my country, my country. I want my country back. And my country back means I'm here, communities of color are here, and I don't like that that's not happening anymore. That's what's at stake. But what I don't get is what you do about it and how the story ends, because the Torah's end is not really a very satisfying end for a cultural, diverse democracy. You guys are very quiet today. Why are you so quiet? Thank you. Susan Kopelman, thank you. And then Andrea, thank you.
All right.
Oh, you're on.
I had an interesting happening in my mind as I read, because it is emotional. It is so much deeper than what your intellect says.
Yes.
So you cannot respond to it intellectually. And this is what happened this week to me. I was watching television and I'm watching an ad, and the first thing on the ad is I think it was for a camera or for a phone, two people taking a picture of each of them together, a selfie, a black man and a blonde. Why does that look so strange? That was the thought that I had. I have no feelings about blacks and intermarriage and all that. And yet it was so strange, because we have emotionally something so deep that they don't belong together. It's not a question of inferior or not inferior. It's something that's very deep. And you ask how you can change that. I think what you can do to change that is to have images like that constantly in front of you, so that you learn to think on a different plane.
Susan, thank you. That's just such an important thing, what you talked about. And she writes about it in the pages that we read, unconscious bias.
Right.
And you see it all the time. I'll just give you an innocuous, but to me, very telling example of this. You have to be a little bit of a football fan to get this, but in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers Green Bay game on Sunday, in the last play of the first half, Tom Brady, you remember him, threw a touchdown, which is the last play, there were just a few seconds left, to a receiver from Tampa Bay named Scotty Miller. Scotty Miller is a wideout, he's a receiver, and he's a white guy, but he's very, very fast, right? So I was watching this sports show on ESPN at 8 o'clock, and Ryan Clark, who is a black former cornerback for the Pittsburgh Steelers and a very excellent commentator, he says, the way he puts it, he says that the cornerback that was playing Scotty Miller was black. And Ryan Clark, this former cornerback who's now a commentator, says, I know exactly what happened. Cornerbacks look at Scotty Miller and they look at his complexion and they think that he's Julian Edelman or Danny Amendola or Wes Welker, who are all white receivers who are not very fast. Their game was they could, catch a ball 7 yards down and then get hit and hold on to the ball, but they're not very good at running fast. He said these receivers, the cornerbacks looked at him, saw he was a white guy, and just came to the conclusion that he couldn't run very fast. And it turns out that even though he's a white guy, he runs very fast. And I think that is kind of the flip, Susan, of your comment. It's unconscious bias. That we all have unconscious bias. And I think a lot of the work to heal our country is to recognize and to heal unconscious bias. And whites and blacks and everybody on the caste system has it because it's something that's been going on for so long. Andrea, your hand is up.
In reading this part, I couldn't help but think of a personal experience in which I felt my own position was threatened and my reaction to it. And I think it's pertinent to the discussion. It was early in my career as a social worker. I worked for a state mental health clinic for a few years, 3 or 4 years, had good relationships with other staff members and the head social worker. And then I was away for a year. I took a leave of absence and came back and met with the head social worker who I had always gotten along very well with. You might call her an elf or female, possibly, but she said to me, Andrea, we've just gotten a whole slew of very young, competent, with it, young social workers, and the older social workers just are not measuring up. And in that moment, in my mind, what I thought was, I have to be careful not to look too chummy with these people who had been somewhat older than me, but been my friends and my teachers. And that was a conscious decision. And sure enough, as a few years went on, these older workers were kind of fizzled out. But this was my personal sense. I felt threatened by my position. So just to bring it closer to home.
Yeah, and figuring out how to respond to people who feel threatened and that their place is threatened, but to satisfy their needs for security, not by putting somebody else down, but by helping them on their own. In other words, I don't have to, the response to that insecurity is not that somebody else has to be below them. It's to respond to their insecurity by giving them what they need for a decent life. And figuring that out economically and emotionally, that's the work that we need to do to heal our country. Other voices, David.
Yes, some of this caste discussion kind of is analogous to tribalism. It's us versus them. If you look different, you appear different, you're a member of a different tribe, and you have to protect and secure your own tribe. I think it's kind of in our DNA to want to belong to one group and view another group as hostile or threatening. And I'm wondering if that isn't the basis of some Black anti-Semitism, that the need to say, well, all right, we're very low on the ladder, but look, there are the Jews. I mean, Louis Farrakhan calls us termites and rodents well, if the blacks are fairly low down economically or socially, wouldn't it be nice to have a group that would be below us? And that may be part of Reverend Sharpton's attitude and some of this new anti-Semitism that exists in the BLM leadership that doesn't call it out. I'm not saying the rank and file of BLM is biased, but the leadership does not call out the anti-Semitism. And some of the leadership even praises Louis Farrakhan as a goat, greatest of all time, including 2 representatives in Congress. So I wonder if that isn't part of this caste system, that they say, well, we may be black, we may not be as educated, we may not be as financially successful, but we're not termites, we're not rodents like the Jews that prey on society. So that's another aspect of caste. It may be a possible explanation of black anti-Semitism, which defies rationality.
Well, David, thank you for that. And that's a perfect segue for a very important project. I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a lot of texture and history and complexity to the relationship of Jews and blacks in this country. It's gone through various chapters, as we all know. And it is true that anything and everything can always be redeemed and repaired and restored. So I think that what you say is true. There is an issue of black anti-Semitism. And I think it's fair to point that out, which is not to say that all blacks are anti-Semitic, but there is the whole intersectionality thing and the identification of Jews in Israel with whites in the South and Palestinians as a people of color with black slaves, et cetera. That all that dynamic is not universally held, but it's there and we have to deal with it. So what we are doing, actually, I think you guys got an email about this yesterday, and a number of the people in the class asked me to just talk about it, is we're doing I mean, we think, my colleagues and I think this book is just so important. We're studying it in various fora. Eliza Berger led a session last Thursday night on the book. Of course, I'm trying to do it with you 50 pages at a time to really digest it. I just think it's a crucial book. But what Elisa's class and what this class has in common is there are no black faces on the screen, and we're just talking to ourselves. We're not talking to another community that's had a different experience. And so we're doing a project where the Western Avenue Baptist Church, which is led by Jeremy Battle, he spoke here the last time we had a Ne'ilah service in person. He is going to teach 2 sessions, and I'm going to teach 2 sessions to both of our communities together, kind of joint study, the Western Avenue Church and Temple Emmanuel. And it's going to be 4 Tuesday nights, once a month, the second Tuesday night of every month for 1 hour from 6:30 to 7:30. The first one is February 9th. And the idea is that when you look at your screen, there will be white Jews from Temple Emmanuel, and there will be black members of the Western Avenue Baptist Church. And that we'll figure out how we can actually be in dialogue about this book. And Jeremy will teach some and I'll teach some. So, and the reason for it is I just really feel like we can't only talk to ourselves. If we want to heal our country, we need to talk to others. So this is going to be a way, and I hope we can really deepen the relationship with the Western Avenue Baptist Church. But some of you reached out to me by email, and I'd be happy to talk about it. If any of you have any questions, why we're doing it. Again, this is lovely for us to understand the book in our own context, but I think to dialogue with a black church is a very important complement to this. John.
My question is how we're going to dialogue in a great big group. I understand that you and Reverend Battle can talk to all of us and we'll all hear it, but right. I don't see how we're going to get dialogue between Jewish members of Emmanuel and Christian members of the Baptist Church in a large group. That was my question.
Okay, yeah, so it's a great question. And the answer is Hashem has, in Hashem's wisdom, given us breakout rooms. So I think that we have to figure out the class. We have an hour, and it will look something like Jeremy will frame an issue, frame up, some pages of an issue. He'll talk about it for 5, 7, 8 minutes. Then we'll have breakout rooms where we have white and black and Jew and Christian in the breakout room. We're also partnering with JCRC, Jewish Community Relations Council. So we need to get facilitators for all of these breakout rooms. Maybe we can get some facilitators from the church and from facilitators from our shul and some facilitators from JCRC. And then they will facilitate a discussion. And I don't have enough expertise in breakout rooms, but I do have a colleague named Eliza Berger who's really good at breakout rooms. And I'm going to ask her for her wisdom about what's the ideal size. So we have to do a lot of planning, John, between now and then. That's why we asked everyone to register, so that we know that we have X number of people from the church and X number of people from the synagogue, and we can distribute them randomly in groups so that there's a representation of both communities. And then after you have your breakout session, then we'll come back to the larger room. So that, look, it's far from perfect, John, but in COVID times, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Fran.
Thank you. I was at the discussion on Thursday night, and I must admit the breakout rooms worked very well, as long as there was a leader who had a set agenda and set questions. And I think that could work very nicely. And there was plenty of communication. There were only 6 people in my room, and it was very easy to communicate back and forth. But that all depends on the numbers, of course. But with respect to David, I would hope that our discussion with the members of the church did not turn into a Black anti-Semitism type of discussion. This book is about racism and what's happened to Blacks in this country. And I would really hope that we would focus on that. We are lucky enough and fortunate enough to not walk around in Black skin in this country. I made a comment on Thursday night, and I don't know how many of you would agree with me, but I see color. I differentiate Blacks from whites in my everyday life, everywhere I go. Then there are certain stereotypes that come to mind just automatically. I'm very sorry to say, when I see Black people, a Black person driving a Mercedes, for example, immediately something goes through my mind. And those are the kinds of things that, as you mentioned, Wes, that we have to start working on ourselves and in ourselves, is to get rid of the biases and the stereotypes that we see every day. I think part of it is that the people who, are racist, well, we might call them racist. I think all of us have a bit of racism in us, to be very honest with you. But they're people who haven't had a lot of experience working with Blacks, or have these stereotypes that they've never tried to overcome. And having a class under them makes them feel more confident in their position. I also feel that a lot of these people lack, good education, lack good job prospects. We are seeing, as Dottie pointed out, more and more Black and white people on the screen together. We see a cabinet that's made up of many more Blacks than ever before. And you've got a whole group of white people who are alienated from government, feels that government has never worked for them. And here's government promoting Blacks and promoting elites and that type of thing. So we've got a lot of issues to deal with, but it's around racism. And I think that's what we need to focus on.
Right. Although, Fran, I think one of the helpful moves of this book is Isabel Wilkerson does not really talk about race or racism, and she consciously avoids using that term. And there's a discussion that she has early on in the book of why using race and racism as a class, as a category, is not very helpful, because it just doesn't promote the conversation. But her whole book is about caste as just kind of this infrastructure, when the power of her book to me is, we've all had 1,000 debates about race and racism. I'm not a racist. You are a racist. I'm not a racist. I don't see color. Of course you see color. We've all had our own version of that 1,000 times. What's new to me about this book is is that we're all caste, C-A-S-T, and a caste, C-A-S-T-E, and we don't even know it. And that the power of caste, like the Matrix movie, is that it does its stuff without you even being aware of it. And that's why you could have Jews who are our age, and we say, oh my God, I never even knew. I'll just speak for myself. I'm 59. I never even knew. I never knew there was a caste system. I just wasn't looking, and her chapter on the Matrix. So I think there's a lot to discuss here, and I'm looking forward to discussing it with a different community that's had a different experience than we have. By the way, I will say unconscious bias work is really hard and uncomfortable. And I think I think that this project is breaking new ground in uncomfortable ways. We've never really had this kind of dialogue before with the Black community. We've hardly had this kind of dialogue just within our own community before. And you can take from the silence of the class today how it's really hard. I'm just noting, just observing, there's a lot of reticence and reluctance and silences. And I think it's really awkward and hard to confront the issues that this book invites us to confront. And if it's hard to do that in an all-white Jewish group from Temple Emmanuel, and we're together every week, imagine how much harder it is to have a real conversation with a Black community that we're just meeting for the first time. And when we say, oh my God, I never knew. And what they want to say is, how could you not have known? What do you mean you never knew? How did you not know this? So I think that this is not an easy piece of work. This is a very hard piece of work, but I think it's an important piece of work. I think it's a spiritual piece of work. I think it's it's a Jewish values-based piece of work, but it's very hard and it's very uncomfortable. It's also, by the way, just add, it's like the big Black Jewish thing we've done at the temple, which is beautiful for 30 years, is we've thrown concerts for Mass Avenue Baptist Church. That's beautiful, and it's musical, and it's lovely. And it raises money to feed the hungry. And who could argue with that? Who could argue with that? This is much harder to do. To have a real conversation about caste and race and unconscious bias, that's tough. That's tough. So good luck to us and the Red Sox, but I think it is an important piece of work. Any other comments, Linda?
I would just like to end with, I think we've made progress. And I don't think we should forget about that. And in Newton, not so long ago, there was a Jewish president, governor, and mayor, which would have been unthinkable. And then my other suggestion.
You mean a Black?
Yes.
Not a Jewish, a Black, right.
Very Black.
Right.
Also would say $15 minimum wage.
Okay.
Thank you. A lot.
Maddie Donoff.
I would like to share with everyone, our daughter Elizabeth lives in DC, and in addition to her full-time job, she has a part-time job with Apple. And the store that she works in is in the old Carnegie Library, and it's in a predominantly Black neighborhood. But predominantly also are the people she works with. And Apple has been doing a lot to work on racial relationships. And so they've created book groups. And Liz every week calls us to tell us about her book group experience. And she said that had she read any of these books alone or dialoguing with other white people, she never would have appreciated what it's all about. But her opportunity to be in a book group, in a racially mixed book group, actually last week she said she was the only white woman in the group, has given her a whole other perspective about what unconscious bias means and about what the very subtle things that we don't even notice that happen to Black people every day. So I think this opportunity for us to have dialogue, and we'll figure out the technicalities, have the dialogue with the church is a wonderful opportunity because we will not be seeing it out of our own lens. So thank you for organizing, and I can only encourage all of us to participate.
Thank you, Maddie. Thank you. And thank you for continuing to read this book. Let me just check in with you. We're about roughly halfway through the book. How do you feel it's going? Is this worth your time? Are you glad that we're reading it? Just by a show of it, how many of you want to continue to read the book and power through it versus giving up? Continue to go through it? Great. Okay. So for next week, guys, we're on to page 200 to 250. And I promise you another wine and cheese pairing. And have a good week. And sign up for the February 9th dialogue with the Western Avenue Baptist Church. Have a good week, guys. Thank you.